Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rob Greenwood. I'm director of the Harris Center, as well as Associate VP, Public Engagement and External Relations for Memorial University. And delighted to join you today in our latest ForecastNL session on climate change impacts on food and farming in Newfoundland and Labrador. My office here on Signal Hill is uncharacteristically beaming with light from the sun, maybe part of our conversation on climate change. So my glasses are transition type. I didn't bring the other ones today, so apologies for that. But in St. John's, we tend to welcome the sun when we get it, so no apologies, actually. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located today and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Today's session looks closely at the impact climate change is having on food and farming in Newfoundland and Labrador. How will climate change affect food and food security in the province? What challenges and opportunities exist for local food production in Newfoundland and Labrador in the face of changing climate, both locally and globally? What solutions are currently being explored? We have some great guests joining us today and a guest moderator as well. But before I introduce everyone, I just want to remind you of the format of today's session. We will start off with a moderated discussion with our panelists for about 25 minutes. Then we will have set aside the second half of the session, as always, for your questions. So get ready. You can post your questions anytime during the discussion in the Q&A box, and we will read them out if we get the chance. The chat function is also available for discussion amongst participants during the session. Please remember, we are recording today's session, which will be posted online afterwards in the ForecastNL forum, harriscenter.ca/forecast-NL, or you can just go to the Harris Center website and find that. Please visit the website to view all of the past ForecastNL sessions and take part in the many active discussions taking place there. We have a citizens forum as part of the ForecastNL series with a demographically representative group from across the island and Labrador. We're delighted to have you all with us throughout the process. So with all that done, I can introduce today's panelists, and lastly, but not lastly, our guest moderator. Let's meet our panelists. We are happy today to Josh, a regular for Harris Center activities, Josh Smee. Josh is the CEO of Food First NL, a provincial nonprofit organization that works with communities in Newfoundland and Labrador to ensure everyone has access to affordable, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. Josh is passionate about systems change and the power of collective action. He has taken a lead role in many coalitions and campaigns. He co-chairs the Provincial Food Security Working Group with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador and sat on the province's Health Accord Task Force. He is joined by Dr. Mumtaz Cheema. Dr. Cheema is a professor in the School of Science and the Environment at Grenfell campus of Memorial University, and along with colleagues, has established graduate degree programs in boreal ecosystems and agricultural sciences. He regularly presents his research work in national and international conferences and has published over 136 research articles in peer-reviewed journals. Just thinking of that makes my head hurt. It's not easy getting published in a peer-reviewed journal. So it shows you the quality of Dr. Cheema's work. He also frequently engages with farmers and organizes field days and farmers' days to demonstrate the outcomes of his field research trials. So he is truly a model of publicly engaged work at Memorial. And we are joined by Susan Lester. Susan, along with her brothers, Brad and Chris, and her parents, Mary and John, run Lester's Farm Market. The farm, which has been operating for over 25 years, focuses on vegetables and produces over 100 different varieties throughout the season. Lester's has expanded into many new areas over the years, including doing school tours, adding a large flower operation with annuals, and even a flower U-pick. The farm features things like an on-site bakery and a petting zoo as well. Susan runs a kids program, Little Lester's, where kids come to farm once a week to learn about farming. The farm recently expanded, adding a second location in 2020. Between the two, Lester's Farm Market employs about 70 people at the peak of the season. And it really is a St. John's and Newfoundland and Labrador institution. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Ivan Emke as our guest moderator for today's session. Ivan spent 25 years at Memorial's Greenwood campus in Corner Brook as a faculty member and a senior administrator. He taught and researched in a variety of areas, including food and agriculture and rural development. He was involved in engaging the campus in agriculture and food research and worked with many local partners, and again, was a model of public engagement at Memorial. He currently operates Kitchen Table Communications. And Ivan, I've been introduced by at many sessions, and he has an amazing knack of reading a bio with completely fictitious information. So I've been a grand pianist. I've been an astronaut. It's just amazing things Ivan has cooked up for me. I'm not as creative as him, so I kept to the letter of the introduction, but I know we're in very good hands. So over to you, Ivan.
Thanks, Uncle Rob. There's another fictitious character. It's wonderful to be here today. And I mean, not here in my basement office studio. I'm here for bits of most of days, to be truth be told, but I mean here, with you folks, even if I can't really see your smiling faces or see your intriguing art choices in the background. I mean, and also to be here in the sense that we're going to talk about food and how it's raised and produced and packaged, and some of it's driven across oceans and forests and deserts to us and advertised and retailed and kind of ends up in our fridges and cupboards. And I love to talk about food and hear people talk about it almost as much as eating it. And the reason is because it seems like the more I learn about food, the less I seem to know. Or certainly the less sure I am about my pat responses. That's what keeps the conversation new, because things keep changing. And talking about food and how it gets to the plate is all about complexity. But alas, the lineup between complex solutions is pretty short. People tend to line up between simple but ineffective solutions. So let's see if we can change some of those algorithms. Yesterday on email, I was fortunate to get links to 32 stories about food and agriculture that some organization or other thought that I should read. How many of these had a theme that was related to climate disruption? 13. So over a third. It seemed like the headlines included words like looming or challenge or foundational. There's talk of high food costs and leaky supply chains and fires and floods and droughts and pestilences, kind of like Old Testament reading. And I'm not including here the stories about fried chicken ice cream or edible squid cups or bacon muffins, stories that take up far too much of my food reading time. Food and climate are closely related. You can ask any farmer, you can ask any gardener, you can ask any policymaker, you can ask any researcher, and we will do that today. Now, this is a panel, but it's a different kind of panel because there are no presentations by our members. There's just questions and conversation. So for you, that means a pretty exciting exchange, but it also means that you don't have time at the beginning to check your emails or see what's trending on TikTok or do your Wordle for the day. So stay with us, okay? Gotcha? This is lunchtime, though, so feel free to eat. I know I will. So let's turn to the panel, though. And first off, thanks for being here, for having lunch with us, and for chatting about food in the process. I want to remind people that Susan Lester is indeed here, but she appears as a telephone receiver. Remember those when people used to have receivers that looked like that? And for some reason, there's some rural internet problems, which is pretty unusual, really, for the region. But she is here with us, and I will have to make sure to keep including you. But if you have something you want to interject, Susan, at any time, just unmute yourself and shout, and we'll be fine. So I wanted to start with the first question that kind of goes to all three of you. And the way it is that Josh is the first one that appears on my screen, and then Mumtaz, and then Susan. So I'll ask you to answer in that order if you can. So the pressure's on Josh. So the first question is just to get a bit of perspective here. What were some of your earliest recollections of when you believed or when you realized that climate change and climate disruption was going to be a thing that affected food production and access to food? And I give her an example of a time that it became really real to you, that we're going to have to sit up and take notice of what's happening to our food system under climate disruption. So Josh, you want to take it away there?
Sure. Thanks, Ivan. Hey, folks. Thanks for joining. I think, for me, growing up, I'm of the age that climate change has always been kind of a looming thing over my entire life. And environmental activism was really one of the main ways that I got into community work at all. So I guess it's always been kind of hovering there. But thinking about some specific moments, I can really think back long before I worked for Food First. I spent a lot of time doing work with a youth serving organization, figuring out what their programs would look like provincially. And a lot of that was going around the province, just sitting down in rooms with people. And I remember sitting down in a room on the north coast of Labrador, I think it was in Nain, doing a workshop with youth and realizing that the climate crisis was so real for people in a way that I live on the island. It's not yet the dominant factor in our daily lives here, but it was for lots of the young people I was talking to. And they really were telling me about how much sort of emotional pressure and anxiety they were feeling by being cut off from their traditional ways of accessing the land and accessing food. And I think that was one of the moments for me that made it the most real. Not all of us in our daily lives yet, this will change, have contact with people whose own daily lives have been radically altered, whose own food ways have been already radically shifted by the climate crisis. But that was one of those moments. And I think it has really, really stuck with me in the years since.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for reminding me, Josh, that an old guy like me, that there are people who have grown up where climate disruption has been a part of their environment. So I should have added that.
Yeah, you like how I snuck in that I'm
yeah, I know. It's very nice. Yeah. Dr. Chima, are there certain moments in your work as a researcher, teacher, where climate change, you realize that's going to be a major part of what I'm going to research in the future?
Very interesting. And thanks, Ivan. Actually, I spent, my whole career in different countries. So starting from Pakistan, US, and then ended up in Canada. So I joined Grenfell campus in 2013, August. And first time I started few experiments at Pinsbrook Research Station. That was not specifically focused on the climate, but actually in 2015, I saw a newspaper in the Western Star that was August 8, 2015. And maybe if somebody wants to see that, still maybe you see the picture. So one lady is sitting in the backyard in Pasadena. And I saw, she is up to, after the rain pattern was so changed in maybe 1 hour. The rain was, according to that report, rain was about 50 millimeter. So that actually drew my attention. And then I discussed with my colleagues that this is happening. We can see actually here. And then one of our postdoc, basically, we discussed, and he collected high resolution data in the last 80 years. So spread into three, different sections, like 1934 to 1959, 1960 to 1989, and 1980 to 2015. So we wanted to see how in the past the temperature, and the other variator, how it looks like, and how, if we model them, how they can impact and give us the idea, particularly for the agriculture production in Newfoundland and Labrador. So when we draw those curves, so from 1980 to 2014, literally February temperature is going up compared to, and that was the minimum temperature specifically. And the other thing we noticed in June, looking into that data, basically, June was literally dry. So when we discuss, in our group that how they can impact basically the climate change and consequently the food security. So really at that time, we realized that looking into the data, so how the future scenario looks like if the weather indicators or the climate change indicators will give us the same picture or it shows us the consistency, then how far that will be good or bad for the future agriculture in Newfoundland. So that first time we realized, because when we saw the data that we saw, in the last 80 years, and when we modeled that and looked, the very, that's very strange actually when we saw that supporting the data, then we discussed, and that paper is also published. But that actually gave us a lot of indicators that how the future looks like, particularly in terms of agriculture. So that was actually in 2015 that we really observed that what's happening in Canada, but certainly across the globe, there are so many indicators that can give us a very gloomy picture of the future climate and also the weather indicators.
Excellent. It's a good example of the erratic nature of what we used to call global warming. Unfortunately, as a disruption. Yeah. Susan, I'll get you to unmute yourself and so sort of answer that question as well. You're of a generation where you probably grew up where climate change was an issue, but are there moments in your at your farm and so on where you folks started to realize, your family realized that you're going to have to do things slightly different? You're still muted. If I just see a little stroke through your phone there. I don't know if there's a way to, if you're on the phone, is it *6 or something like that that unmutes? Something like that. Just check if that works. Just get yourself another sandwich if you're eating there, and while we wait for this. Maybe we'll let the tech. Oh, there you go. Yep. Go ahead.
There we go. Okay.
Excellent.
Perfect. All right. So thanks everyone for having me here today, and very sorry that my technology is not working with my favor today. So yeah, I guess being born and raised on the farm, I don't know if I fully understood it, but I certainly knew the impacts of climate and on our family business. So not only does my immediate family farm, but both of my parents came from a long line of farmers. So I knew that a wet spring meant that it was later getting into the ground, which meant that it could possibly hinder the seeds and the plants and how they were growing. I also knew that cold temperatures meant that there was a lot of late nights and early mornings for families getting out, making sure that things weren't going to get damaged by frost. And also the animals too, make sure that they were taken care of. So luckily, there's been a lot of advancements in technology and practices that my family and other farming families have also used. So greenhouses are fantastic. We've expanded what we do in our greenhouses and how we use them, as well as a few other things like plasticulture and blankets into our fields. And in fact, last night, we were out early in the wee hours of the morning, setting our irrigation system to prevent from getting damage onto our strawberry plants. So it's something that as we'll probably talk about, it's a lifestyle rather than just a 9-to-5 job, because when the weather doesn't cooperate, we have to make sure we get out and tackle it as need be.
Yeah, thanks. Sort of moving from that, and you sort of started to touch on that as well, Susan. There's a lot of talk now about climate change adaptation, which is sort of the term that we're using now, acknowledging that it is happening and it's taking place, but what are the ways that we can adapt? And so we're talking to a policy person who works in policy and a researcher and a farmer. So what adaptation looks like, I'm sure would be different in your different sectors. But just related to food and agriculture, what do you see happening in terms of how we're trying to figure out how to adapt to what is happening? So Josh, from your perspective.
I think there's a few things to really think about here. One of them in the Newfoundland and Labrador context, and particularly on the island, and I think this is something that has come up in these conversations through ForecastNL, is that the impact of climate policy is maybe as impactful or more quickly impactful than the impact of climate reality, right? So we are seeing obviously impacts of climate change directly on food production, but I think a big source of uncertainty in the food space is let's say, for the sake of argument, that Canada and that the provinces within Canada got really serious about meeting our climate targets, which we largely are not. We've blown through all of them so far. But let's say that changes and we suddenly get serious and we're going to do what we need to do to really make a difference here. I think there's some really complicated questions about what that will mean for our food system in this province. So let's say, for example, right now there's a big conversation around the impact of rising fuel prices on the cost of food production. So, fuel goes into all sorts of places. Many of our inputs in food production here are imported. So what happens if we raise the carbon tax by a whole bunch over the next few years to drop down carbon emissions? What would that mean for our food system here? I don't know. I don't think anyone does yet. How will that affect the balance between the cost of things that are locally produced and the cost of things that are imported? And there are many dynamics like that within climate policy that I don't think we've really gotten a handle on modeling, especially at the local level. So I guess we don't know what the scenario of doing something right looks like for the food system here. And that is something I think that really deserves a bit more thought. I think one thing we can probably predict is that food prices are going to continue to rise. I think that's a fair assessment no matter what. So we are seeing, obviously this is a time when we're having a huge amount of conversations about food prices. Not all of that is climate driven. There's obviously geopolitical reasons happening right now. There's also clear evidence that corporations are taking advantage of the expectation of rising prices to raise their prices even more. So there are other things happening. But underneath all that, we do see the climate crisis putting upward pressure on food prices all the time, right? So we live in a province where somewhere between 70 and 90% of our food comes in from outside. Even if we meet our really ambitious target of doubling our self-sufficiency, it's still going to be that massive number. We are part of a really globalized food system. And somewhere in that global food system, every year, there are now increasing numbers of climate disasters that are hitting some part of that supply chain, right? And so I think, again, it's fairly predictable that food prices are going to go up regardless. What maybe is less predictable yet is what that kind of balance is going to be locally, and how does that affect our food system? How does that affect the people who already are struggling to access food affordably? There's a ton of work to do, but I think it's something that should be really top of mind for anyone working in food, is what is this kind of intersection between the climate crisis and price? And then of course, it does look very different in the north, right? In Labrador, our food systems have already been severely disrupted. Nain will within measurable future have the same climate as St. John's, right? And that's just a fundamentally disruptive thing for how people have accessed food in the north. So really, we've got two kind of different conversations between the island and Labrador on this. But I think both, there's some really kind of severe social dislocation happening and coming that we need to reckon with.
Very good points there. I like the idea too that even if climate disruption affects Newfoundland and Labrador differently than other places, we're getting most of our food from areas that are being quite affected. And it's sad to hear that Nain is also going to have RDF as well. But if indeed it has weather like St. John's, as you said. Mumtaz, Dr. Chima, what's, in terms of the research that you're doing on climate adaptation, what kinds of research is being done right now to help farmers to adapt to these different rainfall patterns and so on?
Oh, okay. So Ivan, we know greenhouse gas emission is contributing towards in rising the temperature and impacting the overall scenario of the climate change indicators. For example, right now in Canadian perspective, almost 10% greenhouse gas emission is contributed to the agriculture industry. And the major contribution, if I see in terms of the global warming potential, for example, in the agriculture perspective, for example, manure application and also the fertilizer application, particularly the nitrogen, they are the big contributor. If we apply, certainly that can just bump the nitrous oxide emission, which is in terms of, if we see the global warming potential, so it is 298 times heavier than one molecule of the CO2. So it's equivalent to 298 times CO2 equivalent. So that's actually the big one. But in terms of, if we see the losses, say, so it may not be in monetary benefit, maybe monetary terms may not contribute a huge, but that contributes a lot to the climate change side. So if we see, because again, once we see, they can trap a lot of, the heat if the greenhouse gas emissions are higher. So if they keeping in view their trapping capacity, just like the N2O. So once they trap the light, so then eventually the temperature is rising up. That basically affecting the rainfall pattern and the intensity, and which eventually, if we have a higher rainfall intensity, for example, so due to that high rainfall intensity, that causes a lot of erosion that can, take all the fertile land and the nutrients which the farmers are applying in the field. So this is how overall in general, that these can impact. But keeping in view the impact of, for example, greenhouse gas emission, how can we reduce that? And the Canadian government is spending, a lot of efforts. Just they have established the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. So they want to reduce the greenhouse gas emission up to the level of 2005, targeting 2030. So, and the first time actually I was reading one report. So first time in 2000 when the greenhouse gas emission was lower than basically the source, for example. So that's actually the first time happened. So now the government is actually putting a lot of effort. So again, the one of the recent, they call that, Canadian government actually is putting together with the carbon sequestration with the greenhouse gas mitigation. But coming back towards with the practices or the mitigation or the adaptation strategies which need to be done, and we are actually keeping in view, the current scenario and the forecasting. In Pittsburgh Station, we are doing few experiments in the last few years. 2016 and 2017, one of my grad students, we started a biochar application, and we collected 2 years data. So the idea was, for example, in corn cropping system, because in western side, not most, but few farmers, they grow corn as a silage. So we thought, because again, at the same time, the farmers, they use manure application, but also the nitrogen fertilizer as a synthetic fertilizer. So we thought just try to use the same approach and add, the farmers practicing manure application, and also compare actually the different manure application types, but also the inorganic nitrogen by adding the biochar. So we added, 20 tons per hectare biochars. We thought just to see the effect of these practices on greenhouse gas emission, but also at the same time, we wanted to see is any effect of biochar application on nitrate leaching, for example. So in 2 years data, actually, the biochar application that actually significantly reduced the greenhouse gas emission, both actually three, CO2, methane, as well as the N2 as well. That paper we published as well. And later in the last 3 years, we used a couple of other approaches. For example, when we apply for the audience, if somebody has don't have the agriculture background, once we apply nitrogen fertilizer or manure, so immediately it is converted to ammonium and then nitrate and then the denitrification. So that all processes from the ammonium to the nitrate, and rather before that, once you apply nitrogen through the ammonia volatilization, there are huge losses, right, due to urease enzyme. So thereafter, there are losses with the nitrate, and thereafter through the denitrification, then N2 emission occurs that goes back to the environment, all NOx gases. That contributes significantly towards the rising of the temperature in the environment, but also, increasing the CO2 level in the atmosphere. So keeping in view all these, background and the text, we wanted to see whether biochar or any other BMPs that can help in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So in the last 3 years, we are introducing basically a few other innovative practices. For example, using that crop rotation is not the innovative practice, but that being practiced in other parts of the world, in other provinces as well. So we are using different crop rotation, but at the same time, the innovation or the new technique is we are using some nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors and the nitrification inhibitors. Overall, they call it the double inhibitors or we call it the nitrogen stabilizers. So they are actually effective in reducing ammonia volatilization, but at the same time, the nitrate leaching as well. So we are compiling those results, but preliminary results, they showed, again, the very promising results in reducing the greenhouse gas emission. But we need to adopt certain practices, just as I mentioned, maybe the biochar for the carbon sequestration, but there are a few other practices we will do actually in the coming years, like the cover cropping, the intercropping, again, the residue management, and also the zero tillage. These are some practices that are considered to be beneficial, and that certainly reduce the greenhouse gas emission, which is one of the big, reason or the cause that can emit or cause the greenhouse gas emission. So through these practices, so far I just gave the one example with the biochar. So that we observed and that we collected over 2 years data, but in the last 3 years data, we also measured the greenhouse gas emission through the crop rotation experiments, but also using these innovative, which I just mentioned, the nitrification inhibitors.
Yeah.
So that basically helping. We in next few months we will compile all the data, and then we would be in a position just to present the data and the results.
Good. I think that biochar is a good example too, because what you're basically doing is trying to find the ways in which the inputs for certain agriculture do have climate implications and how to decrease that. And especially as, nitrogen, which is very energy,
very
difficult to make. Yeah. And given that, as you said, Josh, there probably will be some rules around how much nitrogen people can use down in the future. We need to find ways that the farming productivity can remain good and still not use fewer of those. That's a good example. So Susan, from your perspective, you're on the farm. Maybe there are things that you talked a little bit about greenhouses, things that you're doing in terms of adapting to the changes. Does it involve new crops or whatever? But what's happening with you or other farmers that you know in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, so again, it's kind of basically, in order to be a farmer, you need to be able to have the ability to just constantly change and evolve what you're doing from year to year, even sometimes day to day. It all depends. So yeah, we use greenhouses. So Newfoundland has a very short growing season anyways, as in we can get frost right up until Father's Day. As I mentioned, we had a few warnings this week. We did get touched with frost last night on our farm, and we have seen it as early as September. So it's important to make sure that we can kind of extend our growing season so that we can provide local food for longer. So greenhouses is a great way, allows us to get started early. It also allows us to stay later. So we not only start things in our greenhouse, but also have our hydroponic system. So we're harvesting fresh leafy veg right up until we're still harvesting now, actually, right out of our greenhouses. Plasticulture. So if anyone is driving around our farm, you probably see the plastic in the field. It could be clear, could be black. It could also have a blanket. And those are just ways that even a degree or two makes a big difference in being able to actually harvest earlier, again, get into the ground earlier. And that does wonders for us here on the farm. It's really just kind of constantly learning. When you're a farmer, you're constantly learning, whether that be from research that may be being done here. I know we're after working a lot with the government research facility just up the road from us. And they're kind of working on combining different types of plastics or the timings of different plastics and blankets so that, it's protected and, again, extend our season. You can also learn a lot from other farmers. Generally, other farmers, whether it be here in the province or everything's at your fingertips there now as well. So you can reach out to people all across the world and learn from whether it be their mistakes or their successes. And just seeing what works in your area too. As you all know, Newfoundland has a pretty unique climate. And even though you can research a lot on the internet, it doesn't always have a parallel to what we experience here in Newfoundland. So it's learning about the land and what works here and what works for your operation as well. There's a lot of things that would take a lot more manpower or a lot more machines, and not always is that feasible for every single farmer. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you're being environmentally aware. So for us, we do have an environmental plan just to make sure that we can keep farming. So I'm the 6th generation. We're hoping for the 7th generation and way beyond our years that they can come and farm this land as well. So crop rotation, make sure you have healthy soils, replenish the soils, and just be aware of the impacts that anything that you do, whether it be on large or small scale, they do have an impact on the future and ultimately the climate. And then also I do want to speak about consumers too. So because, again, the world has kind of gotten small over the years. And now, we have access to so much more information as well as different foods from around the world, which is great. But sometimes I think it's also important to make sure that our consumers here locally are eating what's in season and freeze or preserve what you want out of season. So strawberries, for instance. Everyone loves strawberries. You can get California strawberries probably in February, March around here, but that's not our season. So in order to kind of not only support the local farmers and the local economy, but to also kind of reduce your own carbon footprint, is best to go to the farm that you can around you and eat what's in season. And also you can grow your own. So there's lots of great avenues to grow your own, no matter how big or small that you are.
Excellent. You probably can't see me, but I was giving the thumbs up to the seasonality thing. Fortunately, I'm not a panelist. Fortunately for you, because I'd go on and on about our expectations for food these days. But I'll remind you that there are some possibilities to put in the Q&A, some questions that you have. So I'm going to start folding some of those in as well. And one of them kind of relates directly to what you were talking about, Susan. So I might just go back to you right away. But the question was, how will climate change activities affect opportunities for local producers to obtain greater shares of the local market? So will they be able to seize the opportunities to fill the voids? Do you see that as being something that's going to happen among you and other farmers?
Are they meaning like going into the grocery stores, like being able to provide to a larger scale? Is that what they're asking?
I guess
about
it would.
Such?
Scale would be part of it, but if the transportation networks and so on, the cost of food from off island or out of the province increases, it might increase the possibilities for local production of those goods, local substitution. Those might be. I'm just sort of guessing, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would definitely impact it. I mean, for us, we're kind of in a unique situation because we do have our own market where we sell about 95% of our stuff directly to our consumers, which is fantastic. I do know that it's pretty hard to get into the wholesale operation. That's actually how my parents started back in the 80s. Before my time, but they always said that before the local food movement, which we must say it has increased immensely over the past 2 years. But in the 80s, it wasn't. So people who were making those decisions, it came down to the dollar value. And growing in Newfoundland, it's just a matter of fact, it's more expensive to grow in Newfoundland. So first of all, you have a very short time frame that you're working with. You're putting all your eggs into a basket, and sometimes that doesn't work. As it was kind of alluded to earlier, all the inputs. Being an island, as you all know, shipping to here is more expensive. And sometimes growing in somewhere like California, I'm just going to pick on them because they have lovely growing all year round. They can do so much more in a season than what we can. So we need to bridge that gap. And I think a lot of that does come from the consumer and showing their support. And I think that has changed over the past few years, again, because people want to see local and they want to know where their farm is or where their food is being grown. That certainly has helped, and I hope it continues. There's always space for more. But I would really love to see more farms in Newfoundland. Right now, it's not a great number, and the average age of a farmer is also pretty up there. So in order to, get to that food security those aims that we're trying to hit, or those goals, we need to kind of show the support because it's hard, it's expensive to become a farmer, and they need the support of the consumer. So hopefully that will continue on this exponential path.
Thanks, Susan. And by the way, just yesterday, Canada Agriculture came out with their results from their survey of 2021, and they listed 344 farms according to their definition of farm for Newfoundland and Labrador, which is down 15% from 5 years ago. So Josh, you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to take one other angle on this question that Mike in the chat raised. I think the other place that we're going to see maybe opportunities for local producers to engage with markets is around transportation infrastructure. So like, it's not really possible to imagine a future in which we achieve our climate goals without radically changing how we move around this province, right? Like right now, the default assumption is everyone drives everywhere in a private car all the time. And that's just not possible if we meet these goals. I think the opportunity here is there may be new opportunities to get people to food or food to people, right? So, Susan's spot, I go out there pretty often. I have a car. There is a future St. John's where it's way easier to get out to Lester's farm by bus because that's just the only option from a climate perspective. I think there's also a future version of this province in which there is a much more localized functional transportation system that might open up some opportunities for local producers to move things locally. And again, I think we need to maybe think sometimes a little bit more radically here. And again, like just on the off chance that we actually do all this stuff, it actually could open some really big opportunities for us. I'm not an optimist necessarily that'll happen, but I think transportation is a big conversation right now around access to food. And there really is some opportunities at the urban scale to be bringing food in more at the neighborhood level and sort of at the rural to urban scale, moving people and food around in a more sustainable way. And I just think it's possible to think about that really impacting opportunities for local producers in the medium term, I'd say.
Yeah, excellent. Dr. Chima, you work with a lot of local farmers and so on. Do you get a sense that there's going to be more local production? Are they going to be able to make the adaptation to increase the amount of local food, root crops, for example, that we're eating?
Yeah, I mean, in the last NLFA meeting, we presented something about on the climate change. And again, I mean, this is something very important, which, Ivan, you raised this point. And the farmers are also very well aware of that. And we had a lot of discussion with them. They want to produce, I mean, this is a very important point and the piece of the puzzle is, I mean, all the farmers, and we also want to see higher production or more production, particularly in the province. And Josh mentioned actually, if we see the provincial government target and their efforts, and they want to make it the double in 2022. So, which is, I mean, they are pushing, the policies, and they want to kick off, I mean, with the higher production side. But at the same time, we also need and keep in mind that we need to keep the greenhouse gas emission, but also the BMPs that cannot only produce more vegetables or the grains or the crops, but at the same we need to look into how can we mitigate the effect of greenhouse gas emission as well. So there are a lot of discussion and a very productive discussion with the farmers, and they are basically inclined and they are working just to adapt and follow these practices. And they basically, most of them, they are following, a lot of good things which are already happening, but just to need, some time to have some good discussion and good direction to be done for higher productivity, but at the same time mitigating the adaptation practices.
Thanks. In the chat, you all have access to, you can see some of the complexities around some of these issues. Crystal Anderson-Baggs has been talking about issues around GAP certification and the difficulty of getting into retail stores. But she points out, and this is something that the Agriculture at a Glance pointed out yesterday as well, the Newfoundland and Labrador has some of the highest percentage of direct marketing to consumers. Part of that could be because of the difficulty of getting into stores. But that also makes challenges, as you say, Josh, because you have to drive to different farmers markets or whatever, although hubs are starting. One of the other issues that has been tagged in the chat is around the relationship between, well, we've been talking about terrestrial agriculture, and there's a lot of protein in the ocean too, but there's a lot of availability of compostable materials and so on, and soil amendments specifically because we're creating soil. Do you see things happening, or is there research going on or policy taking place related to increasing the ability of us to have our own local products be used for soil amendments rather than shipping in from somewhere else? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that. I'm not sure which of you
Yeah,
How's
I
that?
will just give a couple of comments. I mean, this is very important. I mean, we started some work with a few industry partners who have a lot of waste. For example, we are working on one project with one mining industry because they are producing a lot of rock dust as a waste material. We are using on that side, but also at the same time, we have actually one project with the Warner Brook Pulp and Paper Mill because they are producing almost 10K of wood ash. We are working with them. Our grad students are working with them. We also completed one pilot with one dairy industry because they have a lot of, through using the anaerobic digester, they have a huge quantity of those. So all these waste material. Recently, we have just started another project with 3F waste recovery because they also have a lot of the fish waste and some other waste, and also with the biomass innovation project, which the biggest project ever have in the history of the MUN. That is a $15 million project. So from that project, we want to again make some novel product from the fish waste, from different, for example, the shrimps or the other all different kind of the aquatic fish or the other waste that's we can see. And Newfoundland and Labrador is, keeping in with the historical fishing, they are generating a lot of fish waste. So we want to make some nano fertilizer using that fish waste, and that project has been started, and we are working on that at the end of the 5th or 6th year, we would be able to make some, the nano biofertilizers just to reduce or just to target of the net zero waste. So these are all waste products, which we are making some growth media development, the growth media to use as a soil amendment to enhance the physiochemical properties of the soil, but also the mineral nutrition as well. So we are working that, and the results are very promising. We will share maybe in the next meetings with the farmers and all the end users as well.
Thanks. Susan, you're muted again. I don't know if you can unmute, but I was just curious from your perspective as a producer related to soil amendments and all the kind of materials you need to get good crops. Is that, what's happening with that for you?
Oh, sorry. Could you hear me there now?
I can. Yes. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. And sorry, it's when I unmuted myself, I missed out part of your question. Sorry, could you repeat it?
Okay, I was just wondering, we've been talking a bit about soil amendments and trying to replace some of the things that we bring off from out of the province with some local materials. Are you finding that increasing? Is there promising areas there where we can do some adaptation in terms of our amendments to what we're putting in?
I mean, yes, there is. Of course, with everything new, there's going to be a cost to it. For us, again, it kind of depends on each farm's growing practices and what they have the ability to do, whether that be staff, machinery, space, whatever it may be. So each farm would be different. For us, we've noticed a big jump in price in how we do what we do, just getting things here for right now. So we had to kind of weigh out. So do we stick with what we know and kind of continue on with that? Or do we try to reinvent the wheel and it could possibly not go well? So for us, for this year, we decided to keep going with what we know works for us and then try to trial out a few different things to see if we can alter so that hopefully next year we can expand the new way onto other crops and hopefully reduce our costs and those kind of in those areas. But it really would vary between farmers from what I would think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We'll get Josh in here, and what comes obvious often in some of these conversations, including in the chats and so on. I'm not sure if lack of food is a problem that's a physical problem or if it's a policy problem. Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I come down pretty strongly on the policy problem side. This is probably not surprising. I think there is good reason to work on localizing our food system. It makes us more resilient against climate shocks. There are also like really deep, important cultural connections that we have to food that are strengthened by localizing our food system and producing more locally. There are good social and medical outcomes to being able to eat food that folks are familiar with and that's local and all these pieces. But at the end of the day, I do think the biggest question for the province going forward around this is how are people going to be able to afford to eat, right? Like it's all well and good if we're producing excellent quality local food in high volumes. But if that food is only accessible to a privileged minority of people, I'm not sure that we've accomplished what we need to on this. And, we know already it's almost 1 in 5 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is going to come from. That number is likely to rise. That's pre-pandemic figures that don't take into account the drastic increases in cost of living that we're facing. So I do think tying this together and recognizing also that like the climate crisis is going to impose disproportionate costs on those folks as well, right? So like if you're the person who's working a minimum wage job in a big box store that you can only get to by your car, there are lots of ways in which your cost of living is going to rise and you're going to be compromising on food prices, right? And so I think we do have to link the climate crisis conversation and the agriculture conversation with how do we put a stronger net under folks at the bottom of the income scale, because otherwise all of this happens in a really small box. And there's good thinking about this, right? Like I think it's pretty possible that this province might be among the first jurisdictions in the world to take a crack at a basic income. That's a real conversation that's happening. That would be drastically transformative to our food systems, right? Like right now.
There seems to be a gap in, we've lost Josh, I guess. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, there we go.
You're back.
You'd have to spend, if you would live on income support, to be able to purchase the nutritious food basket measure, you'd have to spend 147% of your entire income support check, right? So like we're systemically setting people up to not be able to access local production anyways. That could shift though. And I think like recognizing that these climate challenges that we're talking about are going to have those disproportionate impacts is important. Like it would be, it'd be really important to have everyone be able to purchase all this food that's so creatively grown. Let's say we can get past it, find local inputs. And I think that is something really to think about as primarily a policy problem. But it's a tangly policy problem. It's not one that lives at any one level of government. Municipalities have a place here, so does the province, so do the feds. And it doesn't live in one ministry. And that's one of the real challenges here. This isn't just environmental policy and it's not just social policy either. It's absolutely everything. And putting that lens can be a tangle.
Congratulations, you've just further complicated the whole issue.
Yeah, you know you were going to get
not
that.
just food, it's health. You're talking about food is health, and the Health Accord talked about food. Yeah, social prescribing. That's a whole other program though that we should do. But Mumtaz, you have your hand up there. So
yes, I just want to. I have quick comment. And Ivan, you were also yesterday in our meeting in the agriculture working group. So one of our farmers actually pointed out in 1949. Newfoundland and Labradorians, they produce 97% of the food of the requirement. So now we are producing around 10% plus. So we need to look into whether is that affected, due to policies, or we need to look into, and maybe if we can find some good reasons, whether that's all happening due to, what could be that, the factors that basically affected and reduced the local production. So if maybe we need to involve a couple of grad students, probably. I need to talk to our social scientists. How can we maybe work with, the Josh and the other, our industry and the other industry stakeholders to make a good project, just to need to find what were the reasons why we are at this stage now, and what the other factors are. The policies need to be introduced to enhance the local production, production of vegetables, particularly at the affordable prices, but also at the same time, the healthy food as well.
Yeah. It's good. It's a good point. It's pointed out often. Although our diet in 1949 was incredibly different than the diet today, and so I don't think it's really an apt comparison. But the problem is we don't grow as many potatoes as we should, and so on. But we have. I just want to mention that if you want to keep the conversation going, the Harris Center Forum does that. That's going to be posted on the chat in just a moment. And I just want to we're getting close to an end, but. My gosh, I'm tired of, talking about huge problems and then you leave an audience in despondency, like you see, like the world is coming to an end and everything else. But I think the important thing is to provide some sort of a glimmer of hope or something that I can do today, tomorrow, next week, that at least has some agency to it. I'm sorry, I raised that notion. One thing that's happened in Newfoundland and Labrador in the last 30 years or so, as I've seen, is that there's been much more increased interest in growing another carrot in your backyard or something like that. It's not going to feed us necessarily, but there is a lot of latent interest in being involved in food. And how do we capitalize on this? So I want to go around one last time and say, what's the thing that gives you hope? What's something that you would suggest? What's some small victories that we've made? And there have been small victories and some not so small. So let's end on a little bit more of an ecumenical positive note here. I'm not sure who wants to go first with their note of hope for the future. Oh, great. Nobody wants to go talk about hope.
I'll go.
Gosh, you've got lots of hope. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch, right? One of my hopes is around the impact of new Canadians on this conversation, right? We're seeing more and more folks move to this province and enter into agriculture and do really interesting things. There's a group of Syrian farmers up on the Murray property here in Portugal Cove that have done just a phenomenal job taking over some of that farm and producing in part for the Syrian community in town. There's so many opportunities for introducing new faces and new lenses on food production and meat. There are tons of unmet market needs, right? That I think that's one of them that really fits in, and I think that does, again, if we're talking about sort of the global food system, if we can have folks who are from all over the world living in this province who don't have to import as much of the food that they want to eat, that is an important little piece of it. And I do think there is also, again, wearing my policy hat, between what you see in the health accord, we're going to have a well-being strategy put together in the next number of months as well. There's an all-party committee on basic income that's going to be formed. This province also has one of the widest policy windows for change in this space that any province has. We are reconsidering all of the building blocks that we need to be reconsidering right now. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to get out and say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about the climate and food, here's what needs to happen. And that's not an opportunity everyone in Canada has right now, but we do, right? So that's also maybe an optimistic point is go out, there's lots of people to yell at, so go out and yell at them, basically.
That would make a good t-shirt too. There's lots of people to yell at. Yeah. Mumtaz, what gives you hope for
just last comment. I mean, Ivan, this climate change we are talking about, but the good point with that is that's blessing in disguise. So that will give us, the more growing window. Right now, we cannot produce C4 crops here, but with the extension in the climate due to the climate change, we would be able to. We could be the biggest beneficiary of the climate change here because that will provide some additional heating units. We can grow better crops. Certainly, that will, add some, negative things. For example, the pest pressure may be bigger than right now we have. But that can provide us more heating units and growing degree days, and then we can improve basically the food security in the province as well.
I think that's a whole program in and of itself, that whole rhetoric around that. So we'll leave that. Susan, I see you're, there you're back. So I want to end with a farmer because, farmers actually grow things that we use to eat. So what's your wisdom and your hope for the future?
Well, to be honest, I am pretty hopeful for the future. Again, being able to see people come into our market, we're seeing the support and it keeps growing each year. We're to the point now, after being in our direct customer business, where we're seeing people that were once kids now bringing their kids back. So we know that the connection, people want to know, the farm to table movement, the local movement. So that's growing at a good rate right now, and I hope it continues. I've also seen a lot of new gardeners the past few years. So as much as COVID, the big C word we don't want to talk about really, that has kind of set people back to their roots, to the simple pleasures of growing your own things. And I think that will certainly help people not only enjoy things in their backyard, but also appreciate locally grown foods as well. And again, there's just so many advances in technology. There's a lot of research and scientists that are dedicated to making the impact that we have on the climate and how we can impact our growing season. They're very dedicated to finding us answers and solutions. So I'm hopeful, and I have seen a change already, and I hope it continues the way it's going, if not even more.
Excellent. So thank you to all of our panelists today. I think we've come to the end of the time. Susan Lester, Josh Smee, Dr. Munpaz Chima, thank you for your thoughts on this broad-ranging, complicated topic and being able to answer our rambling questions. And I want to remind everybody to visit the Harris Center ForecastNL website. It's at harriscenterforum.ca/forecast-NL. I'm speaking English, honest. Yeah. Anyway, just look them up. And thanks to Kathy and the team at the Harris Center for pulling the session together. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you at the next session. So keep these things in mind. Keep talking about this with your friends. Grow a carrot. Take care.
Bye.